Hey, Jonathan. Welcome to Test Talks.
Hey Joe, it's really good to be here. Thank you.
It's great to have you on the show. I've been wanting to get you on the show for a while. I know you've been very busy. One of the things I think you've been busy with is you've been one of the main contributors to Appium. You've been moving it forward more and more. I know you were working for Sauce Labs, but I heard some exciting news. You're moving on to an awesome consultancy. So I thought we'd dive into both Appium and what's up with your new gig as your own consultancy. But before we get into it, Jonathan, for the folks that are square that don't know you, can you just give us a little background about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it all started back in 1982 in Phoenix, Arizona. When maybe this is a little too much detail, but more recently, yeah, I did some programming and got into computers and joined Sauce Labs, which hopefully you all know about, back in 2012, and had the good fortune to be put in charge of the team that was kicking off the Appium Project. And the Appium Project is basically the equivalent of Selenium for mobile and beyond, as we now like to say. So it gives you a WebDriver interface for your native iOS, native Android, hybrid apps, and now Windows and Mac desktop apps. And we've got some ambitions for Internet of Things applications and devices in the future. So it's kind of the extension of Selenium to everything beyond the web. But the primary use case and the most well proven out utilization of Appium is with mobile applications. So yeah, I worked on that for the last however long it's been since Appium has been released, maybe 5 years or so. And that's been a lot of good fun building up that community. We have an amazing community of people. I'm by no means the sole instigator of this project, and feel very fortunate to work with a really committed group of core contributors. And yeah, I'm excited to keep doing that, even as I've chosen to take leave of Sauce and move on to new and exciting things for myself.
Very cool. So I'm Sauce Labs is I'm very proud that Sauce Labs is the sponsor of Test Talks. So it seems like a really cool company to work for. I went to the first SauceCon. I met everyone there. Everyone seems really cool. And because you were working on Appium while you were at Sauce, what made you actually make the decision? Okay, I have this great company here, but I can actually go out on my own. What made you decide to actually go out on your own? And could you just tell us a little bit more what that means? What your consultancy what that means? What kind of services? I think be offering products. What that all entails.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I don't know where it will ultimately lead. My initial motivation is a mix of personal motives and opportunity that I saw in the industry. And so to focus on that, it really seemed like Appium has gotten popular enough that there are a lot of people out there who are trying to be successful with it that could use a little help. And I really saw this in my time at Sauce, as Sauce is, the most prominent service provider for Appium in the world. And so we had all kinds of customers that were using Appium, and I started to see customers making the same kinds of mistakes, or seeing that they could be helped along the way in terms of their Appium knowledge or understanding. So I really saw an opportunity to start something here and just kind of try it and see how it goes, and we'll see if the market's there like I think it is. But yeah, the services are going to be pretty simple, what you'd expect. So coming into companies, enterprise companies or what have you, that are wanting to get started with mobile testing and have identified Appium as the tool of choice because it makes sense for the way that their teams work and for their requirements, and coming in and giving a day or two workshop to help get all of their QA engineers on the same page in terms of their knowledge of Appium, or coming in and helping them strategically figure out how to set up Appium as part of their CI pipeline, or how to leverage successfully one of the web cloud services like Sauce Labs, for example. I'm if people want to pay me my rates, I'm happy to go in and write test code for them. But I think that where I'm going to provide value is at a little bit of a higher level, helping them strategically put together their framework and architecture so that then everyone who works at that company can come in and have a solid foundation and framework to start writing their Appium tests. So that's kind of the services that'll hopefully be the day-to-day and bread and butter of the consultancy. As of this moment, I say we, I really mean I guess, not envisioning particular products. But one of the best ways to come up with a product is to stumble across a need for it in the course of doing something else. So who knows what sorts of product opportunities I'll come across. But my main goal is to stay committed to Appium as an open source tool, not to build some kind of proprietary competitive thing to sell. But again, who knows where it could lead. Our first kind of non-consulting related project is going to be a weekly Appium newsletter called Appium Pro. So I'd love to chat a little bit about that with you if that's interesting too.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely. Jonathan, I'd like to dive in a little bit deeper on a few things that you brought up here. So the first one was, you said you've learned a lot from Sauce Labs from common Appium mistakes that companies have made over and over again. Can you give the folks a few examples of common Appium mistakes you've seen and how they can avoid them within their frameworks?
Sure. I mean, I think one canonical mistake is overusing XPath locators. This is a shared mistake with Selenium, but it's kind of a more egregious area in the Appium world because with Appium, XPath is a very powerful way to find elements, but it comes with a pretty big performance cost because XML and XPath type queries are not natively provided by Google and Apple, at least in the way that we would like them to be. So we have to do a lot of expensive calls under the hood to support finding elements reliably by XPath. So you can do it, but typically there's a better way, and it might involve having a conversation with your dev team to put some of the right accessibility IDs or other labels in place. But that's the same as we're familiar with from the world of Selenium, where you have to set up your web page correctly in order to make it testable. So making your app testable is certainly one area of advice. Another kind of problem scenario that I've seen pretty awesome is not setting up your application so that you can get to specific views and specific user states very quickly. So again, somebody might have 10 different tests of the shopping cart functionality, and 8 or 9 of them all go through the same steps of logging in and finding an item to put in the cart or whatever. And this is just such a huge waste of time. You should have a way to kind of set up that state and immediately start a test in that appropriate state. And again, this is really extra significant with Appium because mobile, emulators and simulators being as slow as they are, it can often take a long time to get to the right point in the test. And so just looking for ways to optimize your test code. I could go on, making sure that you're not doing silly things in your test framework, like querying for the visibility of every element that you retrieve, because then you're adding the overhead of calls and time waiting for Appium to do something every time you get an element. So you want to make sure to only lazily request element attributes, which are important in the context of your test code. So a few examples there.
Awesome examples. Thank you for that, Jonathan. So I did ask in my Slack channel that I was about to interview you and for folks to send me some questions. We have one question so far, and I think you've already addressed it, but I just want to make sure I ask it just to make sure that that they didn't miss it. So Greg Pascal wants to know, can you ask how locators are done in Appium? I think you mentioned something about accessibility settings, but is that the preferred way of using locators within Appium?
Yeah, it's preferred because it's fast, it's immediate. Semantically, accessibility IDs are not the same as IDs in web pages. So you should be careful not to totally conflate the two. And accessibility IDs have a purpose other than testing. So you want to be careful not to kind of confuse or ruin the actual accessibility of your application for the sake of testing. But in most cases, setting accessibility IDs on your elements to make them more testable is actually good for making your app more accessible too, as long as you choose accessibility labels that are sensible to human beings who are using them in that accessibility context. So to get back to the original question, is that preferred? Yes, because it's supported cross-platform. Both Google and iOS on the mobile front have a form of accessibility ID, which is very easy to get and gives you kind of a stable hold on that element. What other locators are there? We do have ID, which on Android maps to resource ID, which is a good candidate as well for something that's not accessibility, but is set by the developers. We've got searching by class name, which is kind of like searching by tag name. That's relatively straightforward. The only problem is typically element classes are ambiguous, or there are many elements of the same class, and so then you have to do weird things like index them. And of course, there's XPath, which is sometimes the best way to do things like find an element that has a certain attribute if that element doesn't have an accessibility ID on it. We also have platform-specific locator strategies that give you kind of a little bit more powerful access to the underlying engine. So we have on the iOS front, we have something called the class chain locator, which maps more closely to the predicate string element search mechanism provided by XUI test, and lets you do things that are kind of like XPath, a little bit less general, but sometimes all you need, and it's a ton faster. So there's a couple things like that you can do that are a little more advanced, but they're less standard, so they're not part of Selenium, and we give you access to them for a specific platform in case you need that extra performance benefit for that specific platform. But in general, it's good to stick with something like accessibility ID or ID or class or ID, because that can be something that's more cross-platform, especially if you're trying to test apps across both iOS and Android.
Great answer. I think that's going to be very helpful for a lot of people, Jonathan. So, Jonathan, one controversy that came out of the Automation Guild to me was we had folks talking about Espresso, and another person talked about XUI test, and both of them said that they would avoid using tools like Appium, not necessarily Appium, but they'd rather use the native testing tools for the platforms, because if Apple changes something or Google changes something, other third-party tools that are testing have to change or they break things. But if you use the tools that are native to it, that you have a better chance of having a more maintainable framework. Just curious to know what you think of the pros and cons of using Appium compared to, say, Espresso or XUI tests.
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. It's one that's coming up a fair amount. I definitely think there are pros and cons to both, and I wouldn't say that Appium is the cure-all for your testing woes. But I think the particular argument that you just expressed isn't really valid in practice. It makes sense, and to a certain degree, it's why Appium itself relies on the tools that the vendors provide rather than writing our own kind of automation engine code. So Appium actually uses XUI test under the hood. It uses UI Automator 2 under the hood, and there's actually a driver for Appium that uses Espresso under the hood, and that's in beta, and people can go use that now. Cool. And Appium makes that choice because we also think that it's nice to build on top of the tools that are supported by the mobile operating system vendors. But from a testing perspective, if you've got a test suite, I don't think that you have any guarantee that Apple or Google aren't going to make changes which cause your test suite not to work or cause you to have to rewrite it. For example, Apple completely changed their testing technology from something called UI automation to the current offering XCUI test, and there was no migration strategy from UI automation to XCUI tests. It's just you had to rewrite all of your tests. That's where Appium, I think, actually has a benefit that going with the native frameworks does not have, which is that the Appium API, because it's essentially just the WebDriver protocol, stayed almost completely stable over the switch from UI automation to XCUI test. Now, Appium users had to wait a little bit for the development team to figure out how to reinstantiate the WebDriver protocol on top of this new thing that none of us had ever seen before. And there were some serious technical challenges there, but we surmounted those and were able to offer a version of Appium that for the most part worked the same as it did before. So I think that's actually a benefit of Appium, because you don't know what's going to happen with the vendor provided frameworks, and they haven't shown a lot of stability as much as you might have thought. I mean, Apple just breaks things on point releases for unknowable reasons, and Google releases a new automation technology every couple days. So, I actually think that if you're concerned about the stability of your test code more than the stability of the technology, that Appium is going to be a better choice. However, I think that there are certain scenarios where you probably do want to use Espresso or XCUI test directly, and that's where you have a development team that is also writing the tests, and they're most comfortable in the mobile SDK language, and they're using the Google or Apple provided build tools and development environments, and they want that tight integration between the tests and the app, and sometimes between the test code and the app code itself. So if that's kind of how you roll, then Appium isn't going to provide a lot of benefit to you, because the benefits that Appium provide are, as I said, we kind of build this WebDriver layer on top of whatever the best technology is. So we kind of are the stable interface to the automation technology du jour. And then the fact that we give you a WebDriver interface means you can write test code in any language. You can leverage your Selenium experience. You can leverage, a shared code base with your Selenium tests. You don't have to train people on new technology. And this is a little bit more natural fit for organizations that are structured where they have QA engineers instead of just software developers that are writing both app and test code. And I think it's great for software developers to write both test and app code. And I think that's, in a way, probably what I would recommend, everything else being equal. But the situation is, in reality, that there are many, many teams where this is not the case, and Appium is a really powerful tool for them. The maybe third, if I'm counting correctly, scenario or benefit of Appium is its cross-platform nature. So if you're an iOS dev and you're only an iOS dev, fine, but if you're a team that's maintaining both an iOS and an Android app, and let's say an Electron app on Mac or something like this, that all have basically the same functionality and more or less the same design, just different code bases, then you're going to save a lot of code and architecture by using Appium. So if you have a React Native app, for example, and you're using JavaScript as your coding language, and you have these two apps you want to test, Appium is probably the most natural fit for that kind of environment. So it's a big topic, and I've just said a bunch of stuff about it. We could talk more, but that's my 2 cents.
Oh, excellent answer. I think it's really good counterpoint to what people were bringing up in the conference this week. So this is awesome stuff. The second objection I heard, and I think you addressed this early on, but you really didn't dive deep into it, is that they said Appium Slow. But it sounds to me like a lot of the issues due to slowness is people doing things poorly. So I could be wrong, but any thoughts on people that say Appium Slow?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be, humble for the sake of the project and say that, I'm sure that there are places where it's slower than it needs to be. And those are areas that we could take user feedback and look and see, okay, well, why is this taking longer than you would expect here? And no doubt there are places in Appium's code where we're not being as efficient as possible, or for the sake of stability, we're using a strategy which is slower, and maybe we could give users the option of choosing a strategy which is faster because they don't need that extra safety net or whatever it is. But fundamentally, Appium, I don't believe is slower than the technologies that it relies on. So it relies on, as I said, XUI test and UI Automator 2, primarily for mobile. And we're not really doing much to slow those things down. So if you're using Appium in a way which really, is inefficient, as I said, by overusing XPath or doing some of these other things, yes, it's going to be slow, because then Appium is having to do a lot of work to figure out how to do what you meant on the underlying automation engine, and sometimes that can be very inefficient. So it's really hard to make a blanket comment about it, but most cases where I've actually dug in when people have said Appium is slow, there's something that can be fixed in terms of how they're utilizing Appium. So it's hard to say more really without specific examples, but it's also the kind of thing where we definitely take performance seriously, and we'd love to hear about it. And as I said before, there are definitely scenarios where we favor stability over speed, because unfortunately sometimes the underlying frameworks themselves aren't super stable, and what you would notice if you were using them directly is flakiness, and Appium covers over that flakiness with a little bit of a performance hit as a result. So instead, you get a build that runs more stably, but it may be a bit slower than if you were using XUI test directly or something like that. So yeah, there's a lot of ins and outs to that question.
Awesome. Once again, great answer. So Jonathan, you brought up a point of in the future using Appium for like IoT testing, and I think this has to do with I saw a presentation at Selenium Conf in Austin, I think, on Star Driver or WinApp Driver. So is this what you see as the future of Appium, as being the protocol for all things? Because a lot of a lot of times people need to test things that are more than browsers, and so they need to cobble together all these weird technologies to get it to work. Do you see this WinApp Driver or Star Driver being the solution for those types of things?
That's right, yeah. So that's kind of the Star Driver vision, and I think Jason Huggins coined the term Star Driver at one of the Selenium conferences, and then the one in London a year and a half ago, I gave a talk called App to the Future, I think it was called, and it was all about the future of Appium, and why I think that Appium is Star Driver, and why it's kind of implementing this vision of the WebDriver protocol for anything. Because it's sort of like, why wouldn't you want to just leverage the same type of protocol for all kinds of UIs? I mean, in a way, UIs are UIs, whether it's on a mobile device or on a web page or on your car or on your toaster. There's a limited kind of possibility space, design space for user interfaces. And we could even think more broadly than digital screens for user interfaces. We could think of physical interfaces. As long as you have some way to actually make things happen in an interface, this is the automation engine part, you can put it into the WebDriver protocol. You've got elements or things you interact with, and you've got actions you can do with them. And click works for web. You could overload click to mean tap for mobile, which is what we do. You could overload click to mean flip this switch on an iOS device. On an IoT device. So I think that there's a lot of promise in figuring this out. People like Jason Huggins are building robots to engage more directly with the physical world. So I think he would be a good person to have on and talk about his vision there. But yeah, I think that that's for me what I want Appium to be, and that means that Appium is going to look fundamentally different than a project like Selenium, and it's going to have a much broader base of contributors, people who are going very broad, and people who are focusing on very different areas. So, if we had the Appium IoT driver for some popular IoT controller that's out there nowadays, the person working on that is going to have a completely different sort of knowledge area than the person working on mobile or Windows desktop or something like that. But they'll share knowledge of the WebDriver protocol, and we'll all figure out together how to extend that protocol to generalize it to all of these different cases. So that's aspirational for sure, but we've already proven out the vision to a certain degree with things like WinAppDriver that the Appium team didn't even make. Microsoft came to us and said, hey, we want to make an Appium compatible driver for automating Windows desktop apps. And they're putting a lot of great effort into that. And I've worked with that team, and they're super awesome. And so definitely recommend checking that out. There's a Mac driver that's doing the same thing. So I think we can definitely, keep moving forward into the future. And my hope and goal is to help Appium sort of become Star Driver, even though you never finish becoming Star Driver because there's always something new to automate. So maybe we could call it Infinity Driver. I don't know.
That's a good title for this episode. That's awesome. All right, Jonathan, you brought up some great points, and I'm really excited about that vision. And I just assume that's the reason why you decide, hey, I'm just going to go full out Appium consultancy, because you probably, obviously you believe it in yourself. So a lot of times folks are looking for resources and how to get up to speed with Appium. This is probably a good, if they feel this vision is actually going to come true, that they probably want to get involved in Appium. So you mentioned an awesome resource called Appium Pro. Could you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. It's my forthcoming Appium newsletter. Depending on when this episode's released, it might already be out. So go try and go to appiumpro.com. And it's basically a weekly newsletter. It's going to start off as tips and tricks, things that I think people may not know how to do with Appium that are useful. And then probably some things, there'll be different levels. There'll be beginner and advanced tips, something for everyone, but just to kind of help underscore this vision of all the kinds of interesting things you can do with Appium. So there'll be code examples. If there's anything cool going on in the community, I want to highlight that. So if you've written a framework or a plugin or a driver of your own, or have something interesting in the world of Appium, I want to start pushing that out to the community and have it be sort of a lightning rod of news and interesting methods and facts about Appium that people can subscribe to and just get in their inbox every week. So that's what it is, and I've just been working on the first edition now, and it's going to be on how you populate the photo library of your iOS simulator with photos that you can use in your tests, which is something that people have wanted to do for a long time, and something that you can now do. So go and check that out.
No, that's just so funny. Someone actually brought up that question in the guild. I remember specifically, and someone wasn't know if it was possible. So that's just awesome.
It's possible.
Yeah, cool. So they have to get appiumpro.com to find that out. Okay, Jonathan, before we go, is there one piece of actionable advice you can give someone to improve their Appium testing efforts, and let us know the best way to find or contact you?
Actionable advice. Yes. Today, the actionable advice that I recommend is go check out our new docs, because we released completely redesigned and reorganized and updated docs. So things are so much better than they were. You'll find essentially an API reference for Appium, which is something that we've never had. So every command that Appium supports, it has, which drivers which client libraries it's available in, which drivers it's supported by, code examples, and all the rest. And we put a lot of work into this. So if you've gone to the Appium site before and been disappointed with the docs, like I've been for a number of years, go check it out again today, appium.io, and click on documentation. And so I guess that's actionable because hopefully you'll find something which is actionable for your particular needs today. And the other thought that I would send you away with is consider diving into a little bit of the code and seeing if there's a particular Appium driver that you might want to help contribute to as part of this vision of moving the Star Driver Enterprise forward. You can find me at jlips on Twitter, JLIPPS, or jlips.com. My consultancy is called Cloud Gray. You can go to cloudgray.io, as long as I've actually published the website by the time you try. Yeah, check out Appium Pro, like, subscribe, do all the social media things. I don't know too much about that, but it'd be awesome if you did.